basking in the recent celebrity of Richard and Lisa, subjects of a beautiful feature story in the New Yorker some weeks ago. If you didn't already know it, you know now that among the in the world of independent bookselling, Richard and Lisa are you can have to help me with this, the John and Yoko, the Exene Cervenka and John Doe, numbers X. Yeah, the I guess Julie and Miller and Buddy Miller, Ike and Tina, Sonny and Cher, Beyonce and Jay-Z, and it is just an honor to be back here. It was 25 summers ago that I was first in Square Books, and it has been my joy over the years to both evangelize the world on the good news that the two best bookstores in the nation, if not the world, are in Mississippi. Down the road in Jackson, at Lemuria, and here in Square Books. And I was really pleased to see, Richard, that Casey Kepp, who wrote the brilliant story on you and Lisa, also grafted John into the narrative. And that was a news for me. To me, I knew Lemuria before I knew Square Books. My parents are both from Jackson. And in the summers in college, in the mid-'70s, I would drive north from Belhaven to this little space, I guess it was in the quarter, that John Evans had set up, no larger than a summer pantry. It was the first iteration of Lemuria Books. And you have a lot to be proud of from the state. You know, it's been 8 years since I was back in Mississippi, and I'm really encouraged by the conversations I've had, by the people I've met, by the energies, by the hope that I have encountered and that I am now borrowing from fellow travelers and new friends. It's a tough time for all of us, but you know, Mississippi, in my imagination, both as a writer and a scholar and a theologian, has so often been an incubator of innovation and ideas and movements and language, and to be reminded of that in this summer of 2022 has really been edifying, shall we say. So I want to talk briefly now of an autumn evening in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near the end of the time when I lived so successfully disguised to myself as unaghast and free. It was an ordinary night during my first semester at Harvard's Divinity School. I lay in bed in the low-ceiling, overheated dorm room to which I'd been assigned, when a panic overcame me so complete that from that moment on, I could divide my life between all that had come before and everything that followed. 23 years, 6 months, and 3 days of coming to feel at home in my mind and body, changed in an instant. I had set my oscillating fan to high and slipped into a shallow sleep. It was not unusual for me, after an arousing day of study, to spend an hour in bed, letting my mind roam free, resting in the silences. The first sign that something was wrong came from a crackling sound in the drywall that separated my bed from the one in the next room, occupied by a visiting scholar from a Midwestern college. I knew my neighbor already as one who also suffered from allergies and asthma. He'd been having a rough go of it lately. The building's dust mites and allergens patrolled the hallways. It seemed like prison guards. It's something we talked about briefly, our shared miseries. My own inhaler remained at arm's reach. I clicked off the fan and sat up in bed. It was then that a high pandemonium ripped away everything protecting me from the world outside. I was no longer a man alone in his room. In an instant, I could hear all things inside my body and their deepest repercussions. My heart and its soft aortic murmur, my breath's every exhalation and inhalation, the downward silences, the laborious intake. Would this one be the last? How much noise the body makes when amped on fear. I could hear the hiss of molecules colliding. And outside in the yellow night, the compressors harumping atop the nearby physics building, the sound of car engines and slamming doors. All these things I heard as tormenting assault. I had become a thought, thinking about thinking itself and nothing else. Metaphysics, ancient curse. A cogitation cycling through every autonomous body function, placing on each a question mark, like flowers for the dead. Had you known me in those divinity school years, you might not have noticed anything unusual. In the tradition of the preacher's kid, I could strike a cynical pose. I kept a quiver of pot shots that I could aim at the moral majority. I could appear impatient with small talk and genially discontent with the state of things. I could lace my speech with expletives or smoke a joint. Aware of the suspicions surrounding evangelicals at Harvard and white Southerners in the North, I helped organize fundraisers for Food Not Bombs and the victims of the Greensboro Massacre, one of whom had graduated from HDS a few years earlier. The back hatch of my Honda Civic above the Georgia plates was a montage of bumper stickers meant to reassure the comrades. No nukes. Carter for president. Oh, Tomcroft. 9, DACA. The last of palimpsest, placed precisely to cover my once unapologetic roll tide. Sorry, that's my loyalty. To showcase my high-minded ideals on racial relations, I told stories not entirely made up of my father staring down the white knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi, and of my own encounters with Southern violence. One as a witness to a double homicide in Pensacola Bar, leaving the impression I truly hoped that I was worldly beyond my years. I had seen some shit. It would have been easy to miss the way my eyes darted in fear of some new unsettling, or if you had noticed, to think not much about it. I'm unsure now how much even I thought about my state of mind. Obsessively some days, others not so much. It felt as though I'd been strapped in the command center of a mental radar system, constantly surveilling the land and sky for trouble. Ping, ping, ping. What does the Lord require but a basement, I wrote in my journal. I felt that I must discern my darkness, and therein remember that sin is not only what I did, but who I was. I am the one who breathes corruption. How dark could it really get, you might wonder, in the mind of an evangelical virgin hoping to redeem the secular world for Christ? Pretty fucking dark. The breakdown should not have come as a surprise. Impure thoughts had long ricocheted in my brain like bats trapped in an empty milk jug. You ascend the scale of erotic desire until you find God. A Roman Catholic friend had once told me a decade after I left Harvard. Worldly phenomena are the glitter of the holy, he said. All truth is God's truth. The two of us were sitting on a bench in the quad of the Liberal Arts College in Baltimore, where we both taught. It was an early afternoon in May, a few days after classes ended, in the green trace outside the Humanities building. My colleague spoke with a gentle Irish lilt. He wrote ponderous books on the self, books constructed around the peculiar language of existential phenomenology, but that included passages in every chapter that read as lyric. Philosophers, if I may, with continental sensibilities, equal to Heidegger, as my colleague was, and theologians trained in modern German thought, Kant to Heidegger, as I had been, talked a lot in those years about, drumroll, otherness, and the other. It was discourse I found thrilling. This colleague had taken an interest in my work, and on that day he had a few comments on a conference paper I had written. But we both had a touch of spring fever, it would seem, as our minds drifted elsewhere. I told him I wish I'd heard the gospel of the ascending erotic escalator in the churches of my childhood. I'd always assumed you could only find God by sailor diving into shame. It's never too late, he said with a smile. Oh, fair Liam, I do think it was. I never thought that I would find myself writing a book in the genre of neurotica, if that may. I have never been a big fan of memoirs about mental health. I've tried to read many over the years, but I find that there are often really scary books to encounter. And they are often, too often in my estimation, written with a hint of bravado. The memoirs, at least. So there's this come, go with me, gentle reader, as I show you how completely up I am. And by the end of this journey, you are going to be there with me in this theater of terrace. And, I've read memoirs where, everything's going along fine, and then the writer, for some reason, in the last page decides, I'm going to go off all my medications. And there's this kind of, golden sunset moment, and you're left both thinking, wow, I thought things were pretty steady, and, maybe I should try, but you're also more curious to know, what happened, in a month or 2 months. In any case, it was really important to me, as I wrote this book, to try to develop a relationship of trust with the reader, and really trust around this promise, implicit promise, that we were going to be okay. And that there were going to be difficult passages. And there were going to be moments when you may feel the rawness of acute anxiety untreated, but that it was not my intention, at least, to leave you in a place of vulnerability. And that I wanted to write beautifully, or as beautifully as I could, but I also wanted to write with an edifying intent and an instructive intent. So I did not write this book in order to weigh in one more time, despite Alex Morris's beautiful piece in the Rolling Stone and that really fun interview where I just kind of got a little crazy. I still haven't been able to quite, explain to my parents why I felt like I needed to sound like a kind of unhinged minor prophet. But I didn't write this book in order to say anything about the culture wars or about white evangelicals writ large. I've written about that, but God, am I tired of hearing about that. Oh my God, if I don't hear another discourse about white evangelicals in America, I will be happy. Indeed. It was really to write a book that that Richard would love, and that Patricia Hampel would love, and that Jamie Quattro would love. And that took a long time, took 8 years. It took so many drafts. And I wanted to tell a singular story, not so that I could present myself as like the synecdoche or the exemplar of a class or a type, but just out of my own idiosyncrasies. And I think kind of going deeper into the singularities of story and of memoir, of testimony, may have an effect of casting sort of a wider net, if you will, or put this differently, that's kind of an entrapping metaphor of extending sort of the narrative generosity to a larger number of people than certainly some kind of Jeremy ad would have. So, if you would let me, at this point, however, read one more short section, and this is a section in which I am back in Mississippi, and it's just 8 minutes long. But it's not the section I intended to read, but I do think it's a section that is more appropriate for a fair summer evening in Oxford, and when we're maybe feeling the evangelical heat a bit in this room. And it's a passage I really want to read, because I need a little levity and a smile after talking about this book for 6 weeks. And we can together face the dark night of the soul in our Q&A. But if you'll give me 8 minutes, I would like to give you a slightly different perspective on evangelical anxiety than you may be accustomed to in the never-ending dispatches from the press and from the thought makers of our time. I was delivered into the world by a man forever known in the Marsh family as that brilliant Jewish doctor. In my parents' mind, the chosen people occupied a place reserved for people of superior wisdom, though they had no Jewish friends so far as I knew. Though my parents hoped for more children never came. When my mother tucked her sorrows over this, where she tucked her sorrows over this, I'll never fully know. She said to me often and regularly that she wanted a house full of children, but that God blessed her with only me, her special one, who could carry the blessing of all the children she deserved. Always left open, even till the day I left for college when my mom was 39, was the prospect that she might get pregnant again. At first, the promise of a brother or sister was welcome, so welcome that I created an imaginary brother for myself, Michael, who kept me company those years when we lived out in the country. But in time, I developed the sense that I didn't want brothers or sisters, that any sibling would ruin the heightened intimacy I felt with my parents, and especially with my mother. And at that point, Michael disappeared. He was replaced by a feeling of barely articulable unsettlement, the uneasy concern that something would undo our shocking familial closeness, or worse, the concern that nothing would undo it. And so it was a small and close family of three that moved from South Alabama to Laurel, Mississippi in the late summer of 1967. My father was the new pastor of the First Baptist Church, and the family photograph in the Laurel leader call announcing our arrival. I wear a plaid sports jacket, a white shirt with a clip-on tie, and gray garbardine slacks riding high on my penny loafers. My pretty mother stands next to me with perfect posture, one hand resting on my shoulder. The tips of my shoes touch in a kiss. And my father, 6'2", athletic and tan, my God, is he handsome. In the first month there, I found fish hooks and 2 hamburgers ordered at different diners. A pack of boys shrieking like straw dogs rapists led me to a remote corner of the parking lot and took turns farting in my face. How that was biologically possible was a thought that would only later cross my mind. On our first Sunday, a man who the very night before had brought us a large tin container of smoked sausage climbed a ladder to fetch his daughter's cat from the roof of their house, slipped, and died. On my first day of school, a Catholic kid named Riley, son of the local golf pro, curled his fist during recess and punched me in the crotch for no reason, like a phantom, except that, sinners like me deserve a random shot to the nuts from time to time. Everyone was angry and aggressive, even the church ushers. It is true and widely observed that there was no hour of the week more segregated than 11 o'clock Sunday morning. Less known is that no hour was more dreaded by an anxious 12-year-old preacher's boy recently aware of 4 congenitally missing front teeth. Didn't matter where I sat in the cavernous sanctuary. A wiry bachelor named, let's say, Harry Pointer would hunt me down and aim his prickly knuckles at my thigh. "A Charlie horse for Charlie," he would say, as I smiled politely, wanting to kill him. One afternoon, shortly after our move, I lay on the bedroom floor, poring over maps of American towns and cities, envying the geometry of urban grids and rural greens, a pastime that baffled my parents, but felt reassuring to me. When I felt a sudden constriction in my chest, I sent out a raspy SOS to my mother in the kitchen, who found me half naked on tiptoes, pounding my chest like a wild child. "Breathing," I managed. "Not breathing." She did her best to help, treating my wheezing and panic with steam from the shower and the wet cloth on my neck. Of course, it was not the last time asthma would visit. I'd never had allergies before, but now I was allergic to everything: dust, grasses, feathers, hay, plastic, perfumes, and wool. And on top of this, Laurel was home to the largest synthetic wood manufacturer in the world, which produced a pungent orange haze of God knows what that Stevie Forbert in his rock star years memorialized in lyrics, "Going down to Laurel to dirty stinking town." Yeah. Each day brought a new catalog of welts and hives and itches and runaway fluids. My nose was a constant phlegm leak. When the steam or vapor rug didn't help, my mother took me to the doctor for an injection of something that felt great, but kept me up most of the night. I was kept awake too by an absolute terror tunneling through the mind and body of never again being able to breathe. Last section. And then a ray of light appeared my first year in Laurel, like the star that rose over Bethlehem. I was tapped to serve as the narrator in the annual Christmas pageant. It was an honor to be asked, and the first time I assumed a public role performing as the minister's son. Well, other than the fact that my whole life had been performance as a minister's son, and I took it very seriously. It was an opportunity to shine at an awkward age, to present myself as having my own talents and capabilities. Also, it got me out of Sunday evening services. Rehearsals were then. Throughout the week of rehearsals, Harlan Bush, a.k.a. Flame, the local fire chief who volunteered his services each year as the pageant's director, seemed reasonably satisfied with my progress. But two things went amiss that December night in 1970 in the public auditorium at Gardner Park. The first is that I began to feel extremely uncomfortable in my slacks, which were, of course, too tight. I'd grown 6 inches between 6th and 7th grade. I wasn't aware of my response to the constriction, focused as I was on getting the baby Jesus born, until my father's carefully worded caution during intermission. Son, you may not be aware of it, but you've been scratching your wiki a lot, which made sense of the gaggle of high school girls giggling in the front row of the audience. So I retreated to the bathroom to make the proper adjustments and returned to my marquee spot at the podium, ready to shine brightly as the northern star that guided the Holy Family to safety. When the lights came on and the curtains were drawn, the second really bad thing of the evening happened. I was standing on a 3-foot-high platform with an 8-piece brass ensemble to my left, the pianist to my right, and the choir behind me. I was to speak my lines, my earnestly memorized lines, into a squat mic on a stand. Leaning in to enunciate the Magi's arrival, I leaned too far, and my forehead made contact with the microphone. It was truly horrible to behold. The microphone and stand slowly fell to the floor in the silent auditorium. And although most everyone saw what was happening, no one was prepared for the riot of a wired mic hitting tile floor. An errant crop duster missling into the mezzanine with a made less noise. I became aware that Mr. Bush was approaching from stage right. A thick, damp hand grasped my clip-on tie, and in a whisper loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, he said, "Charles Marsh, you have single-handedly destroyed the story of Christmas." So that's enough. I'm so glad we were able to laugh. I would love to talk, ask questions, whatever you want to do, and I'll just see what's on your mind.
Talk about your journey to describe yourself as evangelical. I don't think of evangelicals going to Harvard Divinity School. Mm-hmm. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so, I talk about that in the book and try to give it some context. I had, until I began graduate school, spent all my life deep inside the evangelical subculture, even attending and graduating from an evangelical college in Massachusetts, studying English lit and philosophy. And I suppose at the time I was part of this vanguard that people like Ted and Charles would have studied as scholars, of young evangelicals who were being prepared to engage the secular mind. There were no evangelical scholars or writers in academia, public square. A lot of that has changed now with a kind of emergence of a left evangelical voice, most recently a queer evangelical voice. I don't think that I'm necessarily still in the evangelical subculture, but I had a kind of missional intent in my decision not to go to a conservative seminary, but go right into the belly of the beast, so I could get my bona fides and teach in a secular university and help evangelicals get inside the hitherto impenetrable walls of the secular world. So that's how I ended up at Harvard. I also just loved Harvard Square, and I'd gone to college on the North Shore. Ted.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm not sure your story was quite as lighthearted as you'd led us to believe,
Yeah.
but I haven't read this book yet, and I'm really looking forward to it. Between your first story, the recognition of something going wrong, and now writing it for the last 8 years, there was decades of college teaching, and I was wondering if, this is a personal question for me, asking you as personal. College teaching is so full of million rituals of intense busyness.
Yeah.
Does that help address anxiety, or does that just numb them? And or at some point, is that something? Is that something?
Yeah.
I don't know how to end that question, but
No. I think having been diagnosed, so the context, if I can just give a little context, is that after experiencing this acute anxiety episode in the fall of 1981, I struggled in the days and weeks that followed to understand what had happened to me. I'd read some Freud, and I had taken the obligatory psychology class, but I was still carrying with me the notion that if you cleave to Jesus, you will be too blessed to be stressed. You will not need the business of modern psychiatry, because of course you have in your heart the ultimate healer, the Holy Spirit. And so, while there may be some kind of a theological sense to that, it sets up a collision with reality. And it took me a long time to collide with the inescapable conclusion that the biblical protocols that I so desperately turned to would not heal me, would not address what turned out to be both biochemical, but also sort of deep symptoms, debilitating symptoms that required a new kind of self-understanding and narrative of my life, the kind of language that is crafted in this psychotherapeutic or analytic dialogue, a language that I don't think that's the only place you can find it, but a language that enables me to understand my story apart from the kind of authoritative narratives that I had inherited as a child from family, from parents, from the like. And I knew that students in my dorm had gone over to Harvard Mental Health, but I also believed even more deeply that I had been called to this suffering. I had to understand it as a kind of gift, even though it was, at least in the way I experienced it, perhaps not in the way it was observed, debilitating and increasingly debilitating. I will say this too, Ted. No, I'm not answering your question. When I began talking about the book publicly after it was published in June, which was 6 weeks ago, not knowing the evangelical subculture as a believer, as a true believer, I believe in God, but I don't wear that, wave that banner. I assumed that the culture had changed. That I've observed the rise of some counseling and psychology programs at some evangelical seminaries. I'm aware that in Charlottesville, for example, there are clusters of therapy and counseling centers at churches that I consider to be evangelical and that seem to be doing good work. But I've been told differently by students and by colleagues and friends, that there is this enduring and very deep, I would say not evangelical, not simply evangelical, but Christian fear of the psyche. I'm going to stop there. I didn't answer your question, but I'll be around for the next day. We can figure that out later. Please. Oh, hi. Oh, let me just in the. Please, sir.
Kate Smith.
Hey, Kate.
Very nice to be here.
Yeah.
And,
Oh, hi.
really enjoyed reading so many of your books. Really, I appreciate your story of processing the brutality and kind of the betrayal of compassion.
Yeah.
In the message, the evangelical message, and from a first-person perspective.
I just love the way you said that. So keep talking.
I'm bridging some of your earlier writing too. I'm curious about your awareness of the betrayal of compassion and moral grounding as it relates to justice in community life around race or adultery or divorce, or so many of it. I grew up in First Baptist Church in Grenada. So many of those moralistic positions that the church members persecuted people for. So both the hypocrisy and this fixation on morality of the other, within the fellowship or outside of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think so much of that clusters around this obsessive aspiration for purity. And I just remember in my journals and notes, and this has been the case for 20 years, when I began, 25 years, more, gosh, began trying to come to terms and understand the theological parts of my childhood, and how was it the case, why was it the case that I could be a part of a church that was so zealous in the practices of evangelism, soul winning, and prayer, and community building among the like-minded and white members, dispatching missionaries throughout the world, etc., and remain completely indifferent to, if not contemptuous towards, right, the sufferings of blacks in the Jim Crow South. There's so much about this pursuit of purity that is both not Christian in its historic sense. It's if anything, it trades on a Gnostic influence and on a specific heresy called the Docetic heresy, which claims that God in the incarnation of Jesus Christ did not assume the fullness of human form, only took on the disguise or the veil of the human because of this Neoplatonic idea that the flesh and the spirit are at opposite ends of the great chain of being. So the idea, that Tertullian, or the early church fathers, this is free, by the way, this little church history lesson. once said that in response to this, Platonizing heresies, he thought it within the Christian world. No, God became human in Jesus Christ, genitalia and all. I think he said entrails and all, but he meant like really down into the the depths of our Tellurian existence. And so we saw a pure Jesus. We saw the Jesus in those churches back in the day who we could find in our private spiritual gardens. A Jesus who would surely come soon and rapture the church and take us, the true believers, into the heavens, though I was always sure I would be left behind. Didn't matter how many hours a day I read the Bible or prayed, or how many things I could check off, I would not make it, because on that day when the trumpets blared and the clouds opened, I would be in the moment like just doing something wrong. It could be, I could be playing with myself. I could be looking at a Playboy magazine that I found out in the woods. There always seemed to be porn out in the woods in Mississippi. But something, I'd be left behind. But nonetheless, it was this sense of, getting your hands messy in the work of justice. That doesn't have anything to do with glorifying God and communing with Jesus, walking with Jesus in this kind of etherealized fashion. So I think that works its way into ideas of mental health as well. I think when Christians feel, this is true among all the sort of communities that I've visited, that they, despite how depressed and how immobilizing a depression might be, you just really can't take the antidepressant because you're giving up on this power that's somehow supposed to reside within and heal all wounds, even as you're supposed to celebrate those wounds and live into them somehow. I think it was a friend of mine, a person I met in Nashville a few days ago, was telling me that he had actually been in this situation, called a psychiatrist who was also a kind of a lay theologian, because he felt, even though he has a PhD from Notre Dame, he still felt this sense that, I don't know, I mean, I wake up sobbing and I go to bed sobbing, but I just don't feel good about the antidepressants. I feel like, and this doctor said, you are right now giving voice to the Gnostic heresy, because the brain is an organ, and part of the exquisite breadth of creation and the goodness of creation is this kind of axiomatic truth that, as I said earlier of my colleague Desmond's erotic escalator, that all truth is God's truth. And when psychiatrists and psychotherapists and people working in mental health have found breakthroughs, or certain medications are useful, certain kinds of talk therapies, certain kind of clinical settings, then that's an exemplification of God's truth at work in a field. Please, Susan.
Not dissimilar from Kane's question. I'm thinking about Lillian Smith and the Killers of the Dream and the way sex sends spiral. And stretch whiteness and the socialization of being white might be tied to anxiety for an evangelical, right? To read the gospel and see before you that you're not really being encouraged to live that out with people who don't look like you.
Yeah.
Could create that kind of mental anguish. So I guess I'm asking if you think there might be some connection, and if so, why are there not more anxious evangelicals?
Why are there not more?
Yes, or at least, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I
Being
mean,
honest about it.
yeah. I think the entire white evangelical project is animated by anxiety and fear. It's fear of difference. It's a fear of the impure, of dirt, contamination. The zeal that becomes militant, if not violent, in its expressions, is itself, I think, an attempt to modulate or to mollify the terrorists, to mute and obliterate difference, or to contain difference or to absorb difference in this monolith and the sameness. And I do think that racial purity, as it was named in my childhood, whiteness, I suppose now, though, is a theoretical construct. It's not always clear to me what whiteness means. It's kind of, my years of studying with Richard Warty has, as you know, made me forever suspicious of a theory, because it blinds us to politics and economics and the things that matter, the things that you do. Yeah. So, if I may just come back for a minute to a point that Richard made, that Donald Trump, to take one, the most perplexing of the recent evangelical obsessions, maybe a slow-moving apocalypse, but he's not anyone who has, from my observation, ever worried about the second coming of Jesus, or about the rapture, or about the excellences of Christ, or about all of these things. And I think that that's reassuring to a white evangelical who feels tormented by all of these perceived changes and by this insatiable kind of persecution complex. That he offers and offered a kind of calming and reassuring effect. And those were mirrored, of course, in policies that guaranteed a greater kind of sameness in the way we organize politics and public life.
Yeah.
Please.
Is your dad still a Baptist minister, and how is he handling all this?
Yeah, we were over in Sullivan's Island, South Carolina last week, celebrating his 90th birthday. My mom and dad live in Atlanta. My mom grew up Presbyterian in Jackson, and my father grew up Episcopalian in Jackson. And he had a dramatic conversion in high school. They both were at Central High. My father was kind of a West Jackson ruffian, and my mom was Miss Central High School, 1953 in Jackson, who lived over by Belhaven College. And my mother fell in love with this larger-than-life person who had, become, a Billy Graham kind of impressed young Baptist pastor. But it was her intention to one day bring the marriage back where it should have been all along, and that was within the nice, orderly, confines of the Reformed Presbyterian dispensation. So now, after 20 years after my father's retirement as a Baptist minister, he's teaching Sunday school at Peachtree Presbyterian Church, and they have become Presbyterian. Yeah. And we spent 8 days together, and no one ever mentioned this book. Until the very last minute, when I was literally out the door with Karen to get to Nashville. And my mom said, "I'm going to talk to you just a minute." And I was like, "Oh, here it comes." She said, "I just wasn't prepared for all the intimate details you shared." I said, I know. And I said, how do you feel about all the suffering that I allowed? Oh, that too. That bothered me too. Because of course we never talk about any of these things unless you don't do that. Maybe one more if there's a question or comment. Please.
Did you find any resources in church history, like historical narratives, Bonhoeffer, folks like that, to be of help to you in terms of thinking through anxiety?
Up to a certain point. And that's a great question, because what became obvious to me early on, and it's certainly one of the reasons I wanted to write this book. It's not a theological book; it's a memoir. But there are passages in which I read certain theological books the way a memoirist about menopause. I think Darcy. She was one of my reading friends. Might write about recent research and women's health and the like. But the fact is, there's very little written about anxiety in the Christian tradition, and that's quite remarkable. So we have Kierkegaard, who wrote this little book called The Concept of Anxiety, which is a really vexing little book, which I struggled with and fought with every day for 8 years, which is ultimately unhelpful. And unhelpful. It's completely unhelpful if you're actually anxious. If you're interested in the idea of anxiety as a really effective way to deconstruct the Hegelian system, he's your man. But if you need some help understanding anxiety and, moreover, extricating yourself or finding sources of healing, he's not your person. And I think I said something like, at one point, there are three. It might be helpful to distinguish between three kinds of anxiety. Practical anxiety, which is anxiety that's like fight or flight. It's good, native. It's part of our instinct. If something happens, we move. We're anxious. It helps keep us alive. There's conceptual anxiety, which is the idea of anxiety and the theories of anxiety and the like. And then there's pathogenic anxiety. And like the theologians they love the idea. Paul Tillich talked about it. It's all about sort of our existential needs, or anxiety is the dizziness before being itself, or it's a sense of the environing darkness eternity, of the mystery of eternity that surrounds every move, everything. But pathogenic anxiety, and that's the problem. That's where my students are. I mean, I have been teaching for 30 years. I have not ever seen, as I have the past 3 years, so many students breaking under the pressures of anxiety and depression. And I've seen this in classroom and consultations, and of course we know this to be true nationally. And that is anxiety as this brute, force that cannot be made a subject of reflection. When you're in an anxiety episode of a pathogenic, a somatic nature, you can't take a step back and theorize, poeticize what's happening. You need relief. You need help. You need a psychiatrist. You need a therapist. And so I just think that's so interesting. And I do think that Anne Ulanoff, who was a professor of Jungian psychiatry and theology at Union Theological Seminary for many years, has this wonderful little essay called The Christian Fear of the Psyche, and I think she's really identified something that's pervasive across traditions. I mean, part of that is we feel like we have all the answers. And one Thomas Merton's wonderful essays and his Violence and Faith, he says, the way to move forward beyond this period of, this is a book, an amazing book on the 60s, but it's a book when the church has once again failed. Is to acknowledge as Christians the fragility of our witness, and to find the humility to look at men and women from other religions and from other philosophical or humanistic sources, not as competitors or as recipients of our evangelistic largesse, but as partners and fellow participants in a common work of trying to redeem, trying to solve problems that are both obvious and inescapable to us all. It's as Reinhold Niebuhr's wonderful kind of realism informs us ever again. It's giving up on the idea that we have some kind of, I'm going to use this term in all of its associations, master plan as Christians, and to understand that justice is about proximate, very finite solutions to intractable problems. And in that knowledge, find humility that is appropriate to our work and witness.
I just want to say thank you for the intimacy of the book and the concept of strong sins, and also the ongoing struggle and ongoing redemption. I think that's
Thank you.
just really
That's a lovely way to finish.